My name is Jay Quigley. I've been in the philosophy department for a long time now, and I only really started to think seriously about this issue once I started teaching a course called Ethical Issues and Life Choices. And the more I learned about the topic, the more I realized it was one of the biggest ethical issues I could cover, simply because it affected everyone's decisions. Everyone has a choice on whether to eat meat or animal products. And so the more I learned about this topic, I realized it was something that I could be an activist about and not simply focus on the philosophical aspect, but there's definitely a practical aspect to the problem. So I will talk a bit about the past and the future of factory farming. But basically, my thoughts are going to be organized on these three headings. But I do want to emphasize your questions and get to any questions you might have. So we'll first talk about the anti-speciesist mindset. Secondly, talk about factory farms past and present, and also what the future might hold for animals who are factory farmed. So the anti-speciesist mindset. What is speciesism? Well, it's something, it's a form of discrimination. It's a lot like racism or sexism, in that you are discriminating against certain groups' interests simply because they are a member of that group. So one way that we find speciesism in our culture is discriminating against certain non-human animal species. You will find some animals get presents for Christmas, other animals end up as burgers, and there's not really a clear reason, it seems, in terms of their intrinsic qualities why we should favor one species with our treat one species as food and the other as a companion. Another way that you see speciesism is discriminating against non-human animals in favor of human animals. But basically the concept of speciesism was first introduced to the world, or one of the first introducers was Peter Singer in his 1975 book, Animal Liberation. This is a definitive classic of the animal movement, and many, many animal rights activists have been inspired by this book to start groups from PETA to many animal rights groups, right? Have been inspired by this book, and this is what I take as the basic argument from the book. He starts out by pushing the principle of equal consideration, which is that like interests deserve equal consideration. And to get the idea behind this principle, just think about the interests that men and women have. So they have interests in that they can be harmed or benefited. And one way that I might harm someone with an interest in voting, for example, is by excluding them from being able to vote, when men and women clearly are harmed or benefited to the extent that they are able to choose their own political representation. And so if we push for suffrage for both of these parties, we grant equal consideration, equal treatment to their interests. Otherwise, we're discriminating. If we don't agree with this principle, we think it's okay to discriminate. The second premise of Singer's argument, I take it, is that non-human animals have an interest in not suffering, and that this interest is parallel to humans' interest in not suffering. How do we know this? Well, there's behavioral evidence, for example, that animals respond to pain in the way that human animals do. There is evolutionary and physiological evidence that there are analogous structures. Not only do animals exhibit nociception, that is, they can detect damages to their flesh, but they also have emotional responses to damages to their flesh. In the case of pain, it's a negative emotional response. In the case of pleasure, it's of course not so much a damage to the flesh, but it's positive emotional response. It seems to follow from these two premises that the suffering of animals deserves equal consideration as the parallel suffering of human beings does. So just as we have interest in not being punctured, so too animals have such an interest. And this goes for most, if not all, of the ways that you could think of suffering that an animal, human or otherwise, could suffer. Now, one objection you might get from someone when they hear this is, well, wait a second, humans have a lot of interests that animals clearly don't have. We have interests in voting and marrying who we want to, in planning for our futures and our retirements. You're not seriously arguing for animal suffrage, are you? You're not arguing for animal equality of marriage rights, right? No, that's not the argument. That I will freely admit that humans have more interests, and this is what Singer would say as well. The point is simply that the first row is the same, roughly anyway. Non-human animals don't have any less ability to suffer than human beings do, at least in the case of vertebrates. There's just as good behavioral, physiological, and evolutionary evidence that they respond to pain in the way that other humans do. So if I'm skeptical about the pain of cats or dogs, I should probably also be skeptical about the pain of other human beings. Now, I put a question mark next to the second thing in the column there. There is a bit of an open question among philosophers about whether animals have an interest in not dying, or you might call it an interest in continued life. One of the things that gives me an interest in not dying is presumably that I have a future, that I have certain emotional attachments to, certain plans for, certain desires and goals regarding my own future. And if you were to kill me even painlessly, even without me knowing you're going to kill me, you'd still take that future away from me. I think that's one plausible reason that I have an interest in continued life. Now, in the case of animals, the question also arises: do they have goals, desires of any kind that would ground an interest in continued life? And I think it's an open question for various species. You can ask this. For animals with quite significant attachments to other conspecifics, or significant plans, or a self-concept, you're probably going to find, yeah, they do have some interest in continuing to live. Whereas maybe less cognitively sophisticated animals might not have such plans, goals, desires, and so on, and would have either no interest in continued life or a weaker one. Just to reiterate the point, I mean, we think that men and women are equal in terms of how, their interest in not suffering, their interest in voting for themselves. But, women, they have some interests that men don't have. But it doesn't follow that women are superior to men just because they have interests in mammograms. We think that they're equal in that their like interests deserve equal consideration. And so it's because that principle is obviously true and ethically important that we ought to respect the like interest of non-human species. One other argument from philosophy that I can throw out, I think is important and hopefully motivational, is what's called the argument from marginal cases. Now, you see, when people talk about why humans have rights, they'll often appeal to certain capacities that animals don't have. For example, they might appeal to human intelligence, or the ability to use language. I'm not sure why people think this is relevant, but certainly maybe to ground the right to vote, right? You have to be able to use language and communicate and understand certain things about who you are and who represents you and who makes decisions. It requires a bit of cognitive sophistication. But let's consider human beings that don't have any of that. They don't have language, intelligence, rationality. We still think they have interests in not suffering. And the argument for marginal cases says that if we're prepared to say it's ethical to treat these folks in a certain way, then we should also be able to be prepared to say that we can treat animals in that way. Or vice versa. If we don't think we should treat them by making clothing out of them, or eating their flesh, or using them for entertainment, or doing experiments on them, then it would seem that we also shouldn't do the same thing to non-human animals that clearly have the same kind of sentience, the ability to feel pleasure and pain, and hence the same interest in not suffering. So, in other words, you know, if you would make a belt out of one of these, then you should be prepared morally to make a belt out of a severely cognitively impaired person or a human infant. This is all relevant philosophical background because we use animals in so many ways. Hundreds of millions of animals, well, about 100 million, I think, animals are used in research in the US alone every year. I don't have figures on entertainment, but we certainly entertain ourselves by harming, killing, and causing suffering to animals, as well as making clothing out of them and enjoying the taste of their flesh, their meat. Now, the last thing is what I want to talk about, which is how animals are raised for food, because in recent memory, farms look a lot less like the sort of barn outdoors with lots of space that you might have played with when you were a child or colored in your coloring book. And they look a lot more like a huge factory where everyone is extremely cramped for space. Now there are about 9.1 billion animals killed for meat every year in the US alone. It's about 60 billion animals worldwide per year. And one problem with this is simply that the amount of suffering that each animal in these factories endures is quite astounding. So I can only list a few of the conditions that animal rights activists are concerned about. But they include things like battery cages in the case of hens, which are so confining that hens cannot extend their wings. They basically are immobilized for the entirety of their short lives. They are often egg-laying hens endure forced molting, which is starving the bird for between a week and 2 weeks, just so that their cycle of laying eggs will start sooner. And this is more profitable for the industry, so it makes sense from the financial standpoint to do this to the birds. The pork industry is often indicted for gestation crates, which is a crate that mother sows are put in when they are giving birth, and while the piglets are small, the sow cannot turn around in her cage, and in most cases you find that the floor is simply made out of concrete. Often from the confinement, mother sows go a little insane and bite against the bars. In the dairy industry, you'll find that there are similar issues of confinement, and the profit motive makes things quite a bit more difficult for the cows. So one example of this is that in order to constantly produce milk, a cow has to be constantly impregnated, and so she will be forcibly inseminated by using an artificial means on a routine basis. And as soon as her calf is born, they frequently separate the calf from the mother, and this causes trauma. This is very traumatic for both the calf and the mother cow. Also, the cows are often bred to give out, to excrete huge amounts of milk, and sometimes this breeding has caused them to be unable to walk around, and you'll find that sometimes they become unable to walk, and these are known as downer cows. If you're concerned about the interest in continued life, it's worth noting that the average lifespan of any animal in any of the factory farm industries is well below 10% of their natural lifespan. So dairy cows, I think, live about a quarter of their natural lifespan, but when it comes to broiler chickens, that is chickens raised for their meat, they live at about 2% of their natural lifespan in very crowded conditions. Even if they're not inside a battery cage, they'll be debeaked without pain relief. They will peck each other. Male chicks are executed in the egg industry just because they're male and there's no use for them because they can't lay any eggs. I could go on about other conditions, but I think you get the picture that animal welfare simply isn't taken as seriously as it needs to be. If dogs were treated in these ways, starved for a week, for example, or caused to endure mutilations without anesthesia, we might consider treating the people who did these things like Michael Vick, who went to jail for 2 years for fighting dogs against each other, rather than considering it business as usual. It wasn't always this way, and the recent past of factory farming reveals quite a lot. Turkey and chicken only have reached popularity fairly recently, within the last few decades. So turkeys were slaughtered at about 1 million per year back in the 70s, and since then it's grown about 2.5 times to over 250 million. But chickens, by far in a way, dwarf all other species in terms of how many of them are killed. And it's interesting to note that in the 60s, only about 1.5 billion individuals were killed, whereas by 2007 it got up to be 9.1 billion. Chickens were considered in the middle of the 20th century to be a luxury, whereas now they're as common for anyone to eat as about anything. Any history of how farms got to be so factoryified has to be brief and spotty, but I'll do my best, and I'm borrowing from this this white paper by the factory farm, by the Food and Water Watch, called Factory Farm Nation. Some of the stories include rises in technology. So, just for example, like you see a power milker here, the dairy industry certainly is helped by the fact that machines can do the milking rather than human hands. New, more efficient ways of feeding animals were developed in the 20th century that made it much more profitable to confine animals into small spaces and in large quantities. Selective breeding made it so that animals were quite a bit more profitable. I don't think I said that the average broiler hen weighs about 5 times what she would if she were eating kind of a normal diet. So, and basically they're doing this to toddler hens. So it's like force feeding a toddler to the point that it grows to be 300 to 500 pounds. But selective breeding makes this possible because you breed the fat ones with the fat ones, and you get more meat for your dollar. Growth hormones as well are fed to animals, antibiotics to cut down on bacteria that inhibit growth that are in their stomachs. Vitamins for chickens enable chickens to be raised indoors, which is typically where they are raised, so that the artificial light can be regulated to make the body, to trick their bodies into thinking the day passes faster than it does, which pushes them to grow faster, if I understand correctly. Government subsidies definitely aided animal factory farming. What I mean is government subsidies of crops that are fed to factory farmed animals. So back in 1997, there were supposedly temporary emergency relief funds for corn and soy farmers, I believe, that were meant to be kind of stopgap emergency help for farmers who had endured some rough times in the farming industry. But by 2002, the Farm Bill started making this permanent. So there were permanent subsidies that just gave money to corn and soy farmers, artificially pushing down the price of corn and soy, making it much more profitable for anyone to purchase corn and soy. And this made it more profitable in turn to raise lots and lots of animals at a cheap price, making meat very cheap, driving up the demand for meat. And now these government subsidies are pretty much a fixture of every farm bill that you see in the U.S. Throughout the past decade. Incidentally, these government subsidies also make it much more difficult for people in the third world to afford food, because it competes with their grain prices. Without this intervention into the market, it would be cheaper for us to buy corn from overseas. But because domestic corn is so cheap, we buy domestically, and people overseas stay poor and they can't sell their crops. There were also slack regulations on air, water, and soil pollution that helped make it more profitable to have large factory farms that pollute like crazy. Half of the U.S. carbon emissions come from the beef, from animal industry alone, with beef being the largest contributor to CO2 emissions. Certainly in this kind of environment where there were lots of encouragements to have bigger and more integrated farms, agribusinesses consolidated. And so whereas there used to be small farms peppered across the United States in, say, the early part of the 20th century or before, by the end of the last century, most of the meat industry was consolidated in just a few corporations. And so across any major meat category, you'll find there's only about 4 corporations that control the vast majority of the sector, with Tyson being one that is a major player in all the major industries: chicken, pork, and beef. But to step back and make a cynical comment, it seems like this is kind of unfettered capitalism as usual. While I'm not saying capitalism is the devil, I'm not saying it's entirely bad. There are certainly ways that capitalist economic structures wherein people work for the profit motive have pretty devastating consequences. And I'll go on the Marx bandwagon and say that there are 2 major Asians that capitalism contributes to. So one is alienation and the other is exploitation. So when a capitalist business owner is simply driven by a profit motive, he's got incentives to exploit every resource, every individual that he can. And that's why Marx thought the workers need to unite, because they're structurally encouraged to be exploited, and they need to unite, unionize, and rise up. Animals lacking the linguistic capacities are unable to unionize. They're unable to rise up and fight for their rights. And so this is why they're still systematically exploited, even after unions have been introduced for 150 years among human animals. Alienation is another term that Marx introduces, where he says that the fact that workers get exploited by capitalist economic structures alienates them from their true natures. Where our true nature, Marx thinks, is to go out and explore all the ways that we can be productive without having to do the same darn thing in an assembly line 80 hours a week. We ought to be able to try different activities, use our minds and our bodies in creative ways. This is part of how we flourish as human beings. It's our species' essence. So too, it seems that unfettered capitalism is separating non-human animals from their species essence. They're not able to forage in the way that they would outdoors and establish a pecking order in the case of chickens. It alienates them from the way that they would normally interact with each other in the world. So that was a little disheartening, but hopefully informative. Now we can speculate a bit about the future of animals, and I think this is maybe the most important part of what I'll have to say to you. We can start with a little more pessimism. So globally, the per capita meat consumption is rising, and that's in large part because it's rising in Asia, where China, for example, is getting a lot richer, and there's a lot more demand for meat than there was previously. And so this is a challenge for animal rights activists who really would need to get their message out there in order to retard global growth in the demand for meat and animal products. But there are also some reasons for optimism, even if some of them are a bit speculative. So the first one is simply that animal rights activists are on the right side of history. We've seen a movement from a world which was basically controlled by men of a superior ethnicity or race, to a world that is, I think, more inclusive, where now people are starting to be able to date and marry whom they want to, regardless of their sexual orientation or their race. It seems that this circle of compassion continues, and not too long ago, people of different races or ethnicities who would want to marry each other would have faced widespread social condemnation. And it would have been quite novel not too long ago to think that black people and white people should attend the same schools. But society has continually overcome many of its biases. Even when I was an undergraduate, it was much less common for the typical undergraduate to think that gay marriage was okay. But now when I teach at LSU, it's pretty much everyone, almost everyone, accepts it. So this is just kind of a general speculative way. If we understand that speciesism is just like racism, just like sexism, and that you discriminate against interests by not treating them with equal consideration. If we can get that message out, people would understand they're discriminating every day in the way that they treat non-human animals. Another reason for optimism is that science and technology may help take away a lot of the demand for factory farmed meat. And there's also some trends I can talk about demographically. So in vitro meat is the idea of taking tissue from an animal's muscle and growing meat in a lab, basically. And this capacity already exists, and it was tried. There was a burger made in this way in 2013. It was a Dutch team, and it was consumed in London. In fact, there were 2 burgers created, one of which was cooked, as you see on the left, after it was raw, which you see in the center. This one is actually the other burger. They sort of mummified it somehow. I don't really understand how. It's now on display in a museum somewhere as the first in vitro burger. So this is a technology. I think the burger that was eaten, it costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 to make. But now while that may sound expensive, there were many extremely unaffordable inventions that now populate each of our apartments. These things include microwaves and refrigerators and even computers that fit in your pocket. From the resources I've read, the days of affordable in vitro meat might be only about a decade away. and this connects to a certain way that we might be informed activists. But I can get to that, and if I don't talk about in vitro meat again, remind me, ask me a question. There are some trends that indicate that interest in veganism is on the rise. So, I forget the source for the thing on the left, but this is just a map of Google searches by state for the term vegan, and they have increased in almost every state. Now, I didn't check for, I actually couldn't have checked, I don't think, relative to like the total amount of searches did vegan increase, but hopefully they controlled for that. Anyway, there's also a decrease in meat consumption within the US, and I think in other parts of the Western world as well. Now, what people's reasons are, I'm not quite sure. It might be health reasons, or ethical, or environmental, or some combination of all those. But basically, one of the biggest things that we can do is not only go vegan ourselves and reduce demand for factory farmed products, but also encourage others to do so and engage in activism. So since I'm talking about going vegan, I think I should address a few questions that often get asked, and they are as follows. How many animals would I really save by going vegan? Which meats should I refrain from if I don't go all the way? And come on, man, you know, this doesn't really make a difference, like what I personally choose. I mean, does it? I mean, like, how could I personally do anything about this massive problem? The answer to question one, how many animals would I really save, is as follows. Counting Animals is an awesome animal rights blog that basically focuses on statistics and other ways of using numbers in the animal rights movement. And they calculate that the average American diet involves the consumption of 28 chickens per year, 2 more land animals, 225 fish, and 151 shellfish. Now I should rephrase, it's not that each American consumes that many, it's that's how many animals had to die in order to feed the typical American on the typical American diet. Most of the fish that were killed there were actually fed to the fish that the Americans themselves eat. So to maintain a factory farmed salmon, you need to feed it quite a lot of wild caught fish. So at any rate, if you cut meat out of your diet, including seafood, you would reduce demand for that many personally. The second question was, which meat should I avoid if I don't avoid them all? And interestingly, you may be familiar that most people who cut out some meat cut out pork and beef, when in fact that's, from an ethical standpoint, counterproductive, because the amount of time, the number of days of factory farm confinement that's required for each kilogram produced is way lopsided in favor of the smaller animals having to stay there more. It's not that they stay there longer; it's that there's more of them that need to be confined in order to raise the same amount of protein meat. So just think about it. If you have a cow, a very large animal, and you eat its flesh, it might take you a year to get through it. Whereas chickens are much smaller, and it might only take a day or two to get through its flesh. So that's why you have to raise quite a few more of them in order to produce the same amount of meat. So really, if someone is thinking about, for ethical reasons, reducing their meat consumption, they should start with fish and chicken, because by doing this, you would go most of the way toward reducing your personal demand for factory farmed meat. And so for advocates, it's actually counterproductive if you do it in the wrong way to talk about health considerations, because people tend to associate red meat with worse health. Suzanne?
For milk, does that take into account the calves that the cow gives birth to, that then end up being raised for more beef or veal or something?
That's a great question. I did look at that today. I happened upon it, and it doesn't take that into account. So, yeah, like I said, male calves are often separated from their mothers, and when they're separated, where does the calf go? Well, especially if it's male, it will often go off to a veal farm, and so that's other suffering that you have to take into account. But yeah, these figures don't factor that in. Now, yeah, how big is a calf? Well, you know, about the size of a pig, maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure how you would factor it in, but milk is certainly not innocent. It looks a little more innocent from these numbers than the other ones do. For all you know, right. So suppose that Publix orders chicken carcasses 25 at a time, and the average consumer buys like one of them. Well, what are my odds of like influencing whether Publix buys another one of these cases next time? It's about 1 in 25 for all I know, because you know I don't know if I'm the last one that does it or not. But if it turned out that I am the last person to order a chicken that is the deciding factor in whether they order an extra case next time, then I would be saving 25 chickens. So the probability of of preventing the order is 1 in 25, but the expected value is 25 chickens. And if you multiply these together, you get 1. 1 chicken is about the expected value of me not buying the chicken from the supermarket. This logic also applies to the case of if you're Publix buying a case of chickens from the supplier that comes from the factory farm. Basically, sellers respond to demand, and if you reduce demand, then there will be a response by sellers, and even if you don't know that you are, at least for a group of consumers, reducing their demand. And you don't know if you're the last in that group of consumers that would actually make a difference or not. But if you happen to be that last person, then your expected value is a huge amount of chickens that Publix would have been ordering. And it sort of roughly equals out to be 1 chicken, or 1 item size of meat. And especially when you consider just how many animals the average American consumes each year, you are making quite a bit of difference with your individual choice. But certainly your individual choice is dwarfed by the amount of individual vegan choices you could create by being a clever activist. And so I'll just talk briefly about some tips that Animal Charity Evaluator shares on their website, but of course you can read there for more details. They say focus on farm animals. Like I said, there's 9.1 billion animals killed every year for meat, and that dwarfs the amount of animals killed or used in other categories such as research, shelters, or clothing. Whereas the amount of money is only about, I think this is 3% and maybe 1%. A very small proportion of animal rights money actually goes toward helping farm animals directly. So that, for those reasons, is where you should focus. Focusing on effectiveness is obviously very important. We should ask ourselves questions like, how much good will I do with each unit resource? How much suffering will I reduce per hour of labor? Or how many animals am I going to help with each dollar that I donate? And by keeping in mind questions like this, Animal Charity Evaluators recommend certain activities as well as certain charities. But the recommended activities include leafleting, that is giving out literature, as well as spreading the word through online vegan and vegetarian ad campaigns. Giving talks to a large amount of people, known as humane education, is also something they consider to be a pretty good intervention. They also say that it's not quite clear how much influence you can have, but certainly easy to write letters to key entities to try to influence things in favor of factory farmed animals or farmed animals, period. Protests are also of unknown value. They may have a huge meme value that you get noticed, you get press coverage that makes people think about this issue en masse, but it's just unknown exactly, whether any particular protest will have that kind of success. But certainly, if you think about the history of the Martin Luther King led protest, right? And the iconic moment is giving a speech on the National Mall. So you might think that parallel sorts of endeavors would be profitable if you get the opportunity to spread a meme in the right way. They also say that some good ideas are just not as good. These include volunteering at a cat and dog shelter, one reason being that your labor is pretty replaceable. Lots of people want to do that. They think that zoos promote speciesism, and that they discourage people from volunteering for those. And basically anything where you put a lot of time and effort in helping a single individual. In this case, because the numbers are so huge, you might be better in terms of your overall impact, spreading word about the problems of factory farming to a massive amount of people, trying to get them to reduce their demand for the animal products. They calculate that if you leaflet for 52 hours a year, or just 52 hours period, which is an hour a week for a full year, you would discourage enough people from eating meat that you would save 2,700 chickens. And this is a really, really rough figure, but at least using the figure gives us some idea of in the neighborhood of what kind of impact you would have. So spreading the word is a pretty key thing to do in this situation. We can also think about how we can arrange our careers in terms of how we might help animals. And 80,000 Hours is a career advice source that that helps people to think about how to have an effective career. And one thing a lot of activists don't often think about is maybe I could donate money and go after a high-paying job so that I could support activists in key causes. Advocacy potential is also important. If you can happen to occupy a role in the world where you have a lot of influence in terms of what you do or the decisions you make or the things you say, you can make a lot of difference. And so direct contributions aren't the only way. If all of us started a farm sanctuary, we might help quite a lot of animals, but they would number in the hundreds or thousands. Whereas if we had a lot of advocacy potential, we could potentially save a lot more. Certainly, if you are able to hire a lot of advocates, if you go to Wall Street and make 6 figures, 7 figures, you could hire several more animal advocates to take your place. And especially if they're just as good as you would have been, you would do more good by taking the high-paying job and being extremely generous, or just a little bit generous with your money. And so that's one way to think about it. And this approach to career choice is part of what's the movement known as effective altruism. Now, I know I brought a lot of information. I hope some of it was helpful for you. Obviously, we don't have a huge amount of time for questions, but I'll try to take some. Yeah, Virginia.
Okay, I learned a lot. I learned some things. One of the things that we mentioned was the Emergency Food Act with the soybean and corn farmers, right? Yeah. Just to highlight that issue a little bit more. Part of that civil case being was that the majority of those farmers were black, and if you look at the history of the United States, obviously being slavery, colonialism, sharecropping, the fact that history still exists. So it's just the way animals are treated often kind of reflect the very real suffering that humans face under capitalism. And it's just really interesting because with the People's Climate March, it was this really huge thing, where all these people showed up, but then right after, all the streets were littered and covered in trash. So then you think okay, how can we make sure that the things we're doing isn't just lifestyle politics? It's actually revolutionary, you know, it's not just on the surface level where we're like saying that, you know, we care about an issue but not actually doing something about it. So it was just kind of interesting how, you know, brought it all back together with, you know, the cost-benefit analysis of different things that we can do to ensure that animals' suffering is over. And you know, my opinion is that as soon as we get rid of capitalism, there's no such thing as good capitalism because it was made inherently to be like that. I think that's when we can actually have animal liberation, because if you try to view animal liberation as something that is separate, like, oh, well, we had other rights, so we're great now, it kind of makes it so that you can't really see how it's something that it's like oppression is still happening right now, not because of one unilateral group of another. Like, oh, it's okay. I'm going back too far. Basically, what I'm saying is that, yeah, animal liberation.
Yeah. So I mean, certainly, like with the parade thing, I mean, there are ways that advocacy can be risky, that you're going for broke. I mean, it's not clear whether a certain parade is actually going to change any policy, or whether any particular letter is going to change any policy. But I think we can balance those going for broke, going for the goal types of advocacy with advocacy that's like has a less lofty goal but is more certain, such as spreading the word through online ads, for example, where you're certain to reach a certain amount of people, and statistically a certain amount of them will actually take your message seriously. So, let's see. Does anyone else have a question? Kyle?
Yeah. So I know Gary Yourofsky makes a point that it took us, you know, hundreds of years to treat our own species with kindness, as far as, you know, slavery and the sort of civil rights. How long do you think it'll take before we see a mostly vegan world? Do you think it'll spread faster?
I mean, I'm certainly, you know, I don't have the right crystal ball, but I am inclined to think technological innovation will have to take a lot of the load. It's really hard to think right now that the world will become vegan, but it's not so crazy to think factory that the in vitro meat will replace factory farmed meat. In the meantime, certainly we should go vegan. We should encourage people to go vegan, but we're only going to capture a certain percentage of the population and take a dent in the amount of suffering. For us to think that we're going to end factory farming within the next decade, I think, is a little too optimistic. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't push for it like the Dickens stuff. So yeah, I mean, maybe if in vitro meat ever works out, there could be some sort of social movement. Yes, incredibly hard to predict how that would turn out. Regina?
I just had a certain question. With the, like, so animal liberation front, I just wanted to know, kind of like, what's your opinion on like them, and like how, like, do you think they were important at all in terms of the struggle for animal rights?
Interestingly, I am not super familiar with their history, but I can say that I think it was probably counterproductive for people to use violence in order to promote animal rights or rescue animals from confinement. Simply because by doing this, you're labeling the animal rights movement as something dangerous, as a foe to society. Probably it was also unethical in most cases. Certainly I could take a case and reason about it, and it might turn out there were some ethical ways to use violence in favor of animals, but you know, in many other cases it was probably justified as well. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't condone the use of violence, and I would be on the side, I think, of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, who think it's more effective to use nonviolence to promote your message, to show people who use cruelty just how cruel their cruelty is. Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Because it's like,
you know, that's just like really, you know, just really interesting because, you know, because I remember like someone told me like, oh, the Black Panthers, they were like a domestic terrorist group, right? Because of the things that, you know, they did. Although, I mean, there's different factions, you know, there's some people who way more like ultra left and wanted to take up more violent means, and people who are more rightist that must be like, you know, reservist. So I know there's like different strains of like the animal liberation, you know, movement. But then I mean, I really don't know that, like, you know, that much about it, but I could understand why people would be so pissed off when you have all these petitions over and over again, like, stop putting chickens in cages. Stop doing that. Just stop doing that. And then you get to a point where you kind of want to, like, do something about it, you know? Or you want to, like, free those chickens, or you want to, like, free those lobsters. So just, I guess, like, on a, like, philosophical, like, level, like, what would be the response to not using, you know, and I don't want to say it's violence, I want to say it's like self-defense, because I think it'd be different to like kill the owner.
So certainly it's not self-defense, it would be defense of other creatures. It seems that in general violence is going to be counterproductive, to say the least. Even if you succeed in freeing a huge barnyard of pigs, or, you know, a factory farm full of pigs, for one thing, there's not really much place for these existing pigs to go. The more important point is about reducing demand for future animals that are going to endure suffering. The ones that are already in existence, there's not really much place for them to go. There's not enough animal sanctuaries for them. So they would probably have to be executed anyway, and at least put out of their misery where they would suffer less. But even so, to be in existence as a pig at a factory farm, you're already pretty screwed. So yeah, you're not going to really actually physically liberate any pigs. The animal liberation is, in a sense, a metaphor. What we want is for future animals to, if they exist, live in a free and suffering-free way. So, so I definitely wouldn't condone violence simply on strategic grounds because it's counterproductive, but also because it's unethical to the people that you assassinate. Not only can they suffer, but they're also autonomous human persons.
I just want to point out, I don't know, I mean, I think I learned this like a few years ago, so like it may have changed, but I think like most of the, if not all of the quote-unquote violence committed by the Animal Liberation Front is just like destruction of property. Like I don't think that they've actually assassinated anyone that I know of.
Yeah. So maybe we're assuming too much by even thinking about assassination. But supposing that someone were to assassinate a factory farm owner, I think that it would be counterproductive and also probably unethical. Even if somehow, like, you know, the factory farm was shut down because of the assassination, you wouldn't actually be saving the pigs themselves. What's needed is an actual reduction in demand, because, you know, even if you assassinated that farmer and shut his farm down, somebody else would then have more of a market share to just raise more, you know, more pigs and chickens and whatever it might be. So you're not actually preventing any future suffering by killing the farmer. So, you know, completely unproductive when you think about it that way. So, any more questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. All right. Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully you got something out of it, and it was great to see you all here.